The QN506 is kind of mid, unless you're talking about its ability to absolutely shut down enemy helicopters. It's like Gaijin looked at all the people complaining about helicopters in high tier and said, "Here, have this, my child." And it's a good thing that this tank is so good against helicopters, because otherwise, it's not very good. I'm about to explain why by going down the specs list of this machine, starting from the bottom up. It's a little insulting that China put this much work into designing a specialized turret just for it to be slapped on top of a slightly upgraded T-55 chassis. And by slightly upgraded, I mean that some 10mm thick armor plates were slapped around the driver's viewport. This thing has so little protection that it gets messed up by BMP's autocannons. The only thing that doesn't just immediately cut through this thing like butter is machine guns, which is something at least. Too bad the crew's all lined up in a row at the front like they're trying to be the 2S-38. One shot from the side and they're all taken out. It's not like you can survive a shot from the front either, but a side shot will take out all the crew and still leave the tank intact. You'd think that since it doesn't have armor that can stop anything, that it would at least be kind of fast, but it can't even manage that. The stat card says that the top speed is 31 miles an hour, and while that's technically true, you're rarely going to see it. I've barely seen this thing go faster than 25. I can get it to go 31 if I'm going full speed, downhill for an extended period of time, but it's not like that's going to happen often. Thankfully, nobody's getting the QN506 for chassis. What everybody's actually interested in is the turret, and this is where things get good. Starting with the least interesting part of the turret, this thing has the same 30mm autocannon found on the BMP-3, which is a simplified version of the autocannon in the BMP-2, and the gun on the QN506 decides to combine them both. Take the horrible 330 rounds a minute fire rate on the BMP-3's cannon and add it to the amazing APFSDS rounds that are found on the BMP-2M, and that's what you get on the QN506. Now you might be saying that doesn't sound too bad. The BMP-2M is awesome, this just has a slower fire rate. Well, I thought that too, but there's just something about having the lower fire rate that makes it so that I just can't do well with this thing. Personal skill issue aside, let's get to the parts that everybody's wondering about, the missiles. The QN506 has two types of missiles on it. The large fire and forget QN502 missiles and the smaller laser guided QN201 missiles. Starting with the big boys, the QN502 is the first fire and forget ground fired ATGMs in the game, and the second fire and forget ATGMs. The first of the PARS 3 found on the German Tiger helicopter. These things have some absolutely wild stats when you look at the stat card. They only travel at 205 meters per second, or roughly 460 miles per hour, which is a snail's pace when you're talking about missile speeds. They have a lock-on range of 12.5 miles and a missile guidance time of 65 seconds. It only has a TNT equivalent of 3 pounds, and it has a tandem warhead, so it can pen 1,000 millimeters of armor at any distance. And somehow, this thing is better at taking out helicopters than it is at taking out tanks. I mean, I know why, and I'm going to tell you. It mostly comes down to two things: how the QN502 locks targets and how it flies to targets. The QN502 will lock onto the hottest thing that it can see, which sounds simple enough, but in reality it'll only initially lock onto engines. So when you're facing off against a tank that's hulled down, you can be looking at the entire turret of the tank, and the QN502 just won't lock onto anything. Compare that to helicopters, where the engine is always placed on top right below the rotor. So if you see any part of the helicopter, the engine is the first thing you're going to see. Then once the missile gets in the air, it's still going to track the hottest thing that it can see. So if a tank gets too close to a burned out dead tank, then the missile will lose lock. Or if the tank does anything to obscure its engine, it's going to lose lock. On the flip side, a helicopter really can't hide. As I said earlier, if you see any part of a helicopter, it's going to be the engine that you see first, and there's not much that a helicopter can do to hide its engine's heat. They have flares, but a nice little feature of the QN502 is that it doesn't trigger laser warnings or missile fired warnings, so helicopters are given no indication that a missile's coming for them. And this ties into how the QN502s fly, because even if a helicopter pilot is staring at you, they probably won't think that the missile you just fired is coming at them. This is because the QN502 has two different flight modes. The first is for targets within 300 meters. In this short-range mode, the missile will attempt to make sort of an arc, flying up, then curving down towards the target. In reality, this is basically a direct fire mode. While the missile is good enough to pin anything in this direct fire mode, you don't really get good enough shrapnel to reliably take out tanks, and because the missile is fire and forget, you can't really aim it at the best spot to take out the most crew members. It's just going to hit a tank wherever it happens to hit, which in turn is going to make you have to fire several of these missiles to take out a single tank. And when is a helicopter ever going to be within 300 meters of you? The other flight mode the QN502 has is for targets outside of 300 meters, and this is where it truly shines. In this long range mode, the QN502 will choose some altitude to fly at, then wait till it's almost directly above or below whatever target that it's going after, then it'll make a nearly 90-degree turn and hit its target. This is why most helicopter pilots won't pay attention to it even if they see the missile launched. It's just simply not going in the direction of the helicopter, and by the time the missile turns towards it, it's just too late to do anything. In this long-range indirect fire mode, the QN502 is still going for engines, so hitting a tank at long range might take out a crew member and the engine, which is annoying, but when you're in a helicopter, taking out the engine is always fatal. I have a feeling that as more people get their hands on the QN506, we're going to hear a lot of helicopter players complain about how much of a hard counter they are. You might have noticed that in all this talk about the QN502, I haven't mentioned planes once, and that's for a good reason. While the missile is fast enough to catch planes like the A-10 and the Su-25 in the indirect fire mode, the missile will simply miss every time because the missile flies towards the plane and it'll only turn towards it when the plane is already passing underneath it or above it. Now for these smaller missiles, the QN201s. The QN506 can carry 20 of these, but they are much weaker missiles. They travel at a max speed of 450 meters a second. It takes them 15 seconds to travel 2.5 miles. They each have a tad over 1.5 pounds of TNT equivalent, and they can only pin a max of 200 millimeters of armor. When I first started using the QN506, I thought that these things were basically useless, but I discovered that they actually have some utility if you know when to use them. Against light tanks, the QN201 is consistently a one-shot kill. Typically, I would use the cannon against lighter targets, but I kept running into a problem of the engine saving the enemy long enough for them to shoot back. And with the QN201, that almost never happens. These missiles are also okay at taking out helicopters, but with a pretty big asterisk. The helicopter has to be within 2.5 miles, and it has to be an earlier helicopter like the Huey or Alouette, because anything later than that seems to be able to soak up way too many of these missiles. I fired off 10 against an Apache one time, and it just ate all of them and didn't have a care in the world. Even a Hind takes 3 of these missiles before it starts going down. To round off the turret, I need to talk about optics, because bad optics could make all of these munitions hard to use. Thankfully, that isn't the case. The gunner gets Gen 2 thermals and a 4 to 12 times zoom. The commander also gets those Gen 2 thermals, but it only gets a 3 to 10.7 times zoom, so you're not going to be using it that often. The only real advantage to using the commander's sight is that it's placed so high up on the tank that you'd swear that they were trying to look at the moon. The gunner also gets an IRST track that can lock onto targets up to 5 miles away, which is a godsend for aiming the QN201 missiles. All in all, I think the QN506 is just a taste of what's to come. There's already more tanks in War Thunder that could have fire and forget missiles added to them, and I think that this is Gaijin's way of testing them in a live environment. I mean, outside of how they've been testing fire and forget missiles in the last 3 April Fool's events, and I've been saying that fire and forget missiles were coming soon for the last 2 years. But for now, the QN506 actually makes a decent addition to the Chinese 9.7 battle rating lineup, and it's the crafting event reward that I would choose above the others. The A7K does look kind of nice, but it's not exactly the best choice in air or ground battles right now. And how many people are actually going to choose the Sherbakov as their event reward? It is a top tier naval event reward, so it's probably going to sell for a decent amount, but how many people actually play naval? That's it for this video. I've been working on a review for the A7K, but at this rate, I don't know if I'm going to have it finished by the end of the event. I've been having quite the skill issue with that plane. I will try my best though. I might make a not so in-depth review of it so that I can release that video before the event ends. I'm still not good at ending these videos off, so I hope you all have a great day.